everyone. I'm Regina Campbell, your host of the Legal Zone. Welcome back for season 2, episode 8, where we're going to talk about U.S. data privacy laws and considerations. But first, I have a very special guest today. But first, I just want to go back for a moment and talk to you a little bit about our prior podcast in case you missed it. It was Miami Tech Through the Business Lens, where we welcomed Leanne Buchanan and Jocelyn Brown, two attorneys here in Miami that do quite a bit of work for tech companies and basically are the founders or kind of the forerunners here of bringing also Miami Tech here and are in the thick of things. In the podcast, we basically talk about what the definition of a tech mecca is and whether Miami has become one or not. And if my guests' opinions varied, the panelists' opinions varied. One said, yes, we're here already. The other said, no, not quite. But basically, you can listen into that conversation in the podcast as to what they define and where they believe Miami is. I think it'd be very informative and helpful for small businesses and medium-sized businesses looking for venture capital to start, some growth funds. They talk about certain foundations that are available here in Miami. So if you want to catch that, I recommend it. You can see it on our YouTube channel or Apple Podcast channel, and I recommend you go back and see it. But today I have an incredibly special guest, Elise Houlik. She's the Chief Privacy Officer for Intuit, and she's here with us. Hi, Elise.
Hello. It's good to see you.
You too. So I just want to give you a little background on Ms. Houlik's experience and prior, knowledge and so forth, which is quite extensive. We're really happy to see this. I think she's a terrific guest for today's topic. Ms. Houlik is the Chief Privacy Officer of Intuit, as we discussed. In this role, she drives Intuit's data stewardship vision and advises on complex privacy and interrelated regulatory issues. Her team is deeply engaged in the business of all matters related to product development, data governance, and information security. Elise joined Intuit in August of 2022, and she's based in New York. Prior to joining Intuit, Elise was the Senior VP for Mastercard, Assistant General Counsel, for privacy and data protection, where she led the privacy work for North America and Latin American and Caribbean markets. And she helped serve several global divisions, including open banking, small and medium-sized business, B2B platforms, digital payments and partnership startups, cryptocurrency, blockchain, marketing and communications, human resources, operations and technology, and corporate security. She also held a former role as an Associate General Counsel at Fannie Mae at Washington, and she is also admitted into the Maryland, DC, and New York bar. And she's a certified information privacy professional. She holds a Bachelors of Arts in English with a minor in women's study from Johns Hopkins University and a Juris Doctorate from George Washington Law School. And I just realized I probably should have made sure I had no spelling mistakes in my speaker's notes to you, being an English major. Well, Elise, it's such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. No, it's great to be here. You got a topic that's near and dear to my heart, so I'm ready to go.
I can tell, and I think there's no one better that can help us sort of dive into the chaos that is sometimes the privacy, not just data and privacy laws. Some people don't understand that it's data, privacy, and potentially cybersecurity. And I think we talked briefly before we came, we did this podcast sort of in the intro, basically taking apart the intersection between all of those areas because they do intertwine. So it's really hard for business owners, whether small, medium, or large, I think, to navigate these waters, right? It's a lot of chaos, a lot of changes in law and so forth. So just want to talk to you a little bit about it, help us take it apart, so to speak, and make it a little bit more digestible for, businesses, small businesses or medium businesses to understand.
Sure. I think overlap is a great way to think about it. And what I love about the overlap is that one tends to make the next one more accessible, right? So if you have to start somewhere, I think the thing that we're most used to in the United States and the thing that we can grab onto with a little bit more certainty is conceptually the idea of data security, right? There's data that's been entrusted to your organization. You've got to use it to process business requests, make things work, basically. And you got to make sure that nothing bad happens to that information, right? And a lot of our laws in the US are rooted in that concept in security. how we have expectations that people need to take care of information, and what happens when things go sideways, and how do you inform people as quickly
Mhm.
as possible with enough information so that they can do what they need to do to continue to secure their information and where it is, what's going on with it. Privacy and data protection, I think has always been around. I think the idea that there's certain information that is very, very personal and
Mhm.
it belongs to a particular individual and it helps inform who they are in the world, um, has long existed, as a concept, but now we're in a place where there's so much data, there's so much technology, we're generating data faster and faster every day, and it's enabling this amazing explosion of innovation. There's lots of great work out there. There are new products and technologies out there. The very fact that we were talking earlier about how we've spent the last 2 years speaking to each other in these little boxes, right? Like that's because data and technology have made this happen. And like what a world we live in. But that just means that all of the mindset you have about security as maybe a foundational starting point is what you've got to continue to apply to that information. More information is more things to keep track of. And what I like about privacy and data protection in general is that it brings to the idea of not only securing that data and holding tight to it where you need to, and preventing it from exposure to parties who shouldn't be seeing it, but also it forces the question of why, right?
Mhm.
And that to me is where it really gets interesting, where you've got information that you're entrusted with. The expectation is, of course, you're going to keep it secure, right? You're
Mhm.
going to do everything you can to stop a bad actor or some other party from accessing that information. But when it comes to using that information, are you sitting there and thinking about the impact to the individual to whom it belongs, the reason for why you want to use it, deciding if it's the best information for the reason, and
Mhm.
so on. And then you get into some really, really interesting conversations about how to build something, how to make something happen. And chaos you're talking about is the laws acknowledging that we're at a moment in time where this is happening day to day as new, fintechs and startups and all these different entities are exciting and getting into the market are playing with the same data. And how do you come up with some sort of legal construct to put boundaries around that work?
Mhm.
Frankly, really hard to do. It's hard.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's kind of my thought too, because I mean, even just from an internal point of view as a sort of business lawyer, right? I think to myself, my clients, everything from data that's being collected on the business side to employees' access internally of that data, even just from the point of view of not even reusing it, but making sure they're securing it. You think of doctors' offices, you think of banking, you think of companies that have such sensitive information about people. You can tell so much. I mean, when I do discovery and litigation, financials are protected and there's a limited scope and with the financials you can obtain, in a litigation. It has to be relevant to the pleadings. Why? Because financials can tell you so much about your habits, where you eat, where you shop, what you buy, um, your sort of hobbies, if you pay child support, if you don't. It can say so much about you. So in general, as a business owner, I'm always advising them to have security protocols in place, even when they're small, for protecting, the data internally, even if it's with employees. But it's a whole nother world when you go external. So in other words, of course, we know that we have to protect the businesses owners have to protect if they have a website, and they collect, clients' information. Of course, they have to keep it private, have to have a certain level of security, right? Minimal that's considered reasonable for the industry, depending on which industry you're in. But in general, it's just so important. And I think like this is where we get into the chaos. The laws are trying to figure out because it could be so potent, so to speak, right? It could be so absolutely dynamic
Mhm.
that they can read what people anticipate, what people are going to buy. They see their shifts and patterns in shoppings and everything, right? So I see the EU is much more protective, right? EU laws are generally more protective. They have more transparency rights. You're required to let them know where your data is being held. You're required as a platform, depending on if you qualify under their laws, to give the users their, data, copies of the data that you're storing. The data user has the right to ask you to remove it. There's also limited consent on how you can use this data, and if you intend to use it another way, you have to ask permission, which is what you're saying. How do we put contracts and laws on this? And I think a lot of, just to give an example, the U.S. laws haven't totally caught up there. And California's a little bit ahead of the game, and Virginia is making some laws. Each state is trying to like find its way, so to speak. But then how do you balance that, right? So in the EU, many U.S. sort of companies may not know that if they do business in Europe or in the European Union specifically, right, they could be subject to those laws there as well. Correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the sharpest contrast between the EU approach and how things are evolving in the US, to my mind, in addition to sort of foundationally coming from a different starting point, and we can chat about that in a second, they build layer upon layer upon layer of regulation, right? And so, for those of my friends who've suffered through law school, laws are sort of the boundaries, and the regulations are the implementation piece. And that can get very, very complicated, because effectively what you're trying to do is push boundaries that people have to then interpret and operationalize, right? You have to make that happen to comply with these different layers of regulation. And so, as you mentioned, the GDPR is the law of the European Union. And that really, to the extent that there were countries that were not looking in the direction of data protection, that sort of woke things up, right? So it's been around for 4 years now, I guess, to 2018. And it follows a long history of prior directives and whatnot. So in Europe, privacy is a human right. It is a fundamental human right. It would be as though in the United States it was baked into the Constitution that everyone has the right to privacy and owns their data and has the ability to control it and whatnot. They take it very seriously. There's all sorts of historic reasons why that's the foundation for the approach. So when they're evolving with their regulations, they're coming from that place, right? So they're looking at it in terms of what choices are offered to the individual, how much information needs to be provided so that individual can make an informed choice, where the technology has proliferated to the extent where the choice is meaningless, to your point, right? I mean, there's a lot of stuff that goes on just through interaction with a website that they're very, very sensitive to. They've got regulations coming about marketing communications, cookies, as you mentioned, and ad tech, AI, and they are really leaning hard. And I think, the interesting thing in the European Union, that has come about, as you mentioned, thinking about how you interact with your employee base and maybe protect information that's entrusted to you, and make sure you don't inadvertently cause any security concerns, is they've folded in the concept of employees and their individual information having value and how employers treat that information. And so all of that is sort of swirling in the background and has been for some time. And then you look across the ocean to the United States, which has just a very, very different landscape when it comes to governing data, right? We've got, at the moment, no comprehensive privacy law at the federal level that would cover the entire country. We have sectoral laws. So to your point, we've got GLBA that covers the financial sector. We've got HIPAA that covers the healthcare sector. There's laws for education. There's laws for children, interacting online. So it's very siloed and fragmented. And then at the state level, historically, you just had breach laws. There were different breach laws. Yeah. I think there are 54, right? So every state in 3 territories, and they're very similar, but they're not identical, which is a lot of fun, right? When you're having security concerns and things like that. Now we see, though, in the absence of a comprehensive federal law, the states filling the voids. California was the first out of the gate. They've got a law that, again, is, I would say, inspired by the GDPR, but it's not identical, and it takes a very different approach. Then I think California was in effect for 11 months, and then it changed, right, through the ballot initiative. So come January, we're going to have the CPRA instead of the CCPA. And along with that, Virginia passed a law. We've got Colorado, Utah, Connecticut. They're all going into effect next year. And, my suspicion is that as we hit, state assembly season and they gather up and they get going, with more earnest, at the beginning of the year, we're going to see more, right? And so there's going to be this parallel conversation of, are we going to have 54 different omnibus privacy laws in the US? Are we going to have one national standard that's going to come in and preempt everything? TBD, right? That's again, more of the chaos.
And I think part of the problem is, as you pointed out, there's more a naturally sort of rooted privacy expectation of like a human rights in Europe, where here privacy is still quite evolved. The concept of privacy is still quite evolving, right? Even what does privacy mean? How far can you stretch it? Some people are trying to, contract it, so to speak, and what it might mean. And there's a lot of protection in this country. I know when I have to issue subpoenas on Google or try to get information from some of these platforms, there's additional rules that go into it because of the privacy laws that do exist, but for the individuals that could be potentially quite protective. But then it trumps. It's like they step on each other's feet, so to speak, all of the different state rules and all the privacy concerns. So, some people don't realize that you have to be, if you do business across the United States, if you're a Florida business and you're doing business in California, you're on the internet, and you do business in various states, you still might be subject to some of these state laws, which really creates a problem for businesses to figure out which laws, especially as they start changing them, some of these states. And then are some of these states' privacy laws going to be subject to constitutionality issues because they step on something on the US Constitution, the way it's being defined, privacy, for instance, because it's sort of shifting this idea of privacy rather than becoming more expansive. It seems like we have a slight trend towards a little bit more contraction right now on definitions of privacy or what that means, what protections we can actually say we have. So I have to tell you, even just as a litigator, when I have to try to explain the slight distinctions between the different acts. Well, this one you can't, this is unauthorized use of a computer, but this is the theft of the information, and I have to and you qualify for both of them. It's kind of silly. It hasn't really caught up with the technology, so to speak, and how people are abusing it in the same manner as well. And going back to our original sort of idea of how to help businesses, how do businesses navigate that?
It's difficult on a number of levels, most of which you've sort of walked through. But I think, if you wanted to, historically, when you've had conflict of laws and things, and they seem to govern the same subject matter, one approach could be to take the most restrictive, the harshest law, the one that's most difficult to comply with, and just say, look, that's it. That's the standard across the board. And here, that might get you 70% of the way, right? But then you really have to balance it against sort of what your business objectives are, how you genuinely are using the data, what kind of data you're talking about, what are your practices for outreach. To your point, I can be a business in the United States with no offices or no outlets or any presence in Europe at all. But if I'm sending advertisements to people who happen to reside somewhere in Europe, I may be tripping up the GDPR without even knowing it, right? Because I'm trying to, engage with them in some way, attract them. So I think, for me, and in the many places that I've been able to luckily work in this space and grow as a professional in privacy, it's important to know the laws that are going to impact you, right? Understand which ones apply to you, which ones don't. Chances are that unless you are a very, very small business that is completely localized and only engaging in one state area, chances are you're going to end up tripping one of these other state privacy laws. And if you take a step back and think about what's the objective here, foundationally, there's a lot that can be done to get you to show how you're trying to comply with the laws. And what I mean is really, it's the basics about understanding what your data is. What information are you taking in? Where are you keeping it? Why are you taking it in? What's the reason for its use? Are you sharing it with third parties? And what are your expectations? How do you communicate that with them? Really getting an understanding of what your data footprint is the
Mhm.
first step, I think. And the definitions, to your point, of what is personal information. I have a measure of sympathy for the drafters of this legislation, because the biggest challenge in this space, and it will be going forward, is that the minute you get through the juggernaut that is the legislative process, and you have an actual law and it is published and ready to go, the minute it is granular and very specific about certain types of technology or certain types of data, things like that, it's almost out of date the day it gets printed. So
Correct.
you
Yeah.
end up seeing these super broad definitions where anything that arguably might be able to possibly be linked to an individual is personal information and part of the scope, right? So for me, worrying a little less about the nuances, if you're just looking for a place to start, and
Mhm.
focusing very, very intentionally on what kind of data you're interacting with,
Mhm.
will serve you well. It will work. Knowing that and understanding that about your organization and what the parameters are and where
Mhm.
maybe you have to shore things up will always help you navigate any of these different state laws. There's not going to be a law that comes anytime soon that says, you don't have to worry about
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. No. Definitely not. Yeah, and you think about even like the credit bureaus or like different agent, companies that hold credit cards, that they have a certain duty to actually notify their customers if there's been a data breach. Um, but I think to your point, it's about taking a more practical approach. Look at your specific, business, how it's using the data, what it's doing, with like taking that approach and starting there. And I guess always being proactive. I guess you would recommend that, right? Because if, sometimes businesses do change, they might evolve, they might add another product line that starts to acquire additional data information, or they're using additional third-party vendors. So I always tell my clients, I think that's a great advice. And just keep an eye on it, because I do see businesses grow, in different ways, and they kind of add products, and then they have to maybe think about how that might affect their original analysis. And like you said, technology changes too. So I wanted to ask you, like, at what point, like a size of a company, or do you have any parameters that you would recommend companies should have sort of separate privacy officers, right? Because at one point, this can become sort of a mammoth to just keep track of. If you're a medium-sized company, maybe with, a couple hundred employees or a couple thousand employees, when does that, because it becomes harder, everything from the employee information and data, right, employment files, so to speak, to also client information, right, cutting across different servers, countries, technology, software. At what point is there a point in which you recommend that a company have a privacy officer?
Yeah, I think, and to me, that's been the most interesting thing about this field, is that it is not uncommon to have, as they say, the one man band, right? So the attorney who is the general counsel and the chief privacy officer and the chief human resources officer, and so on. And look, there's a practical reality to that, right?
Yeah.
Companies have different resourcing available to them, size and scope. And so I think, to me, if you're really interested in growing as a company that uses data to fuel whatever your mission is, whatever product or service is, at the very least, you want somebody thinking about these issues almost no matter the size, right?
Okay.
When it comes time to having a full-time job, the beauty about this space is it can grow organically. I think the most important thing you can do is get the attention of leadership and help
Okay.
them really appreciate and understand not only the risks when there's non-compliance or there are challenges there, because look, those are really significant, and I definitely don't want to downplay them, right? That is something that drives this space, especially as lawyers, right? We're always looking at the risks and everything. But there's a huge amount of opportunity. There's a huge amount of opportunity to being thoughtful and trying to get this right from the start foundationally, and propelling your commercial, objectives, moving faster because you know where your information is, you understand who you're sharing with it, so you can make decisions quicker and whatnot. And so if you're on the smaller side and perhaps, wearing many hats, start that conversation. Start that conversation with leadership so that when the time comes and you look and you see that your day is filled with 90 hours of work and only one person to do it, then I think that paves the way for that. I need some extra hands to be credible in this space. If we're going to say we're going to focus our attention on using data to provide this amazing product and service, I think more and more you start to see that to be really taken seriously, you need to have somebody devoted to the function.
Gotcha. So what you're saying is basically you're going to know when you can't keep shifting hats enough in a day. It's kind of indication that you're ready for someone to kind of.
Yeah, unless it's sort of driven by law, right? So again, if we want to look to our friends in Europe, and other laws have similar requirements where they require embedded in the law somebody assigned responsibility over privacy, right? So if you're falling into that bucket, you're going to have to appoint someone, and they can come in different flavors. They could be sort of a role like I have, where the chief privacy officer is ostensibly responsible for the entirety of the program and the way a company might use data and the methods behind it and whatnot. There's also requirements for individuals like a data protection officer, which is a very specific compliance role that needs to have some independence from the people who are building the things and making the decisions so that they can advise. So you'll see those, and if you trip up those requirements, then you're going to have to navigate that. There are a lot of different ways you can do that in terms of staffing. But I think more realistically, if you're thinking practically day to day, I think to be taken seriously in this space, you've got to be able to point to somebody who has this as their key area of focus. And then candidly, the work it's endless, right? Like you're going to know. So again, in order to capture the attention of the leadership team, who is going to give you the thumbs up or thumbs down on funding for additional resources or extra hands or outside counsel or contracted work or something to help, you've got to show them the business value of this too, right? And then I think things start to happen.
Right. And that's where I try to be proactive with my clients if they don't have something in place and I'm kind of foreseeing, this could be an issue, or their systems, they might come to me on an employment issue. I'm defending their company, non-compete or something of that nature, an employee that went off or took their, someone took their confidential information or the client list. So as I hear this, I kind of go, well, did you have this in place? Did you have that in place? You know what I mean? And invariably the answer is no. And unfortunately, it also can lead to a lack of protection, right? We can potentially someone's case, but it also exposes them to additional risks on different sides, from a customer side to data breach. And I try to explain to them the importance of it. And it seems so daunting to most business owners. They just look at me like, something else I have to do, Regina? So, but I think you said it best. It's to mitigate risk. And also when you get to the point, it's endless. It's so important to do so. It's from a business responsibility point of view, from a legal point of view, from the right thing to do as well. Because I'm sure as a customer, they would not want their information just sort of being tossed around and used for anyone to see what's going on in their lives. Like in a hospital, you go to a hospital, you don't expect the nurses or the doctors to be telling someone, oh, so-and-so is having this done. You have a right to privacy. So, so I think it's important. It still seems daunting, but I think you've been able to definitely bring it down to a level that makes it very simple for them to understand, take it apart. It's layered. But they all depend on each other, and there's a reason for it. There's and also business sense to do this, and the importance of doing it, and why legally we have to, and keep an eye on everything. And I give a practical way in doing so. And that's important because it's really hard to understand that, and hard to accomplish that. Do you have any other sort of tips for businesses? And I'm not saying plug anyone's software, but just in general. Well, I mean, just for the record, I do use QuickBooks, so, Okay, so.
Yes.
Yeah. And I like it quite a bit. Yeah, I like it quite a bit.
I think look, I think the first thing to do is ground yourself in the fact that you, no matter where you are in your organization, if this is in your, wheelhouse and you're trying to get your arms around this, the very, very, very first thing to remember is you cannot do this alone. You can't. And so then it becomes a matter of, okay, I happen to be fortunate enough to have a team of really bright and engaged attorneys helping me along and helping me propel our program forward. Not everybody is that lucky, right? If it's just you, think about who is doing things in your organization that is likely to intersect with what you care about, right? And so you think about the information security team, to your point, right? There's going to be a person or people responsible for maintaining the network, looking for threats, thinking about how to protect the information that is being processed day in and day out, right? Like that's your new best friend, right? Because together you're going to be much more impactful than if each of you kind of go off in your own silos and give either redundant information when you're engaging with the business in general, or worse, conflicting, right? And so finding that person, privacy has evolved as a career where I happen to sit in the legal organization, and I have for the entirety of my career in privacy, but it could just as easily sit in your enterprise compliance group. It can sit in information security. It can sit in risk, right? Companies have different places to put it. If you're not in one of those groups and your company has somebody who's taking care of that, make friends with them too, right? There is a compliance aspect to it. There is ultimately going to be a conversation that talks about the risk of choosing one path versus another. And you want to do that collectively so that you're speaking with one voice, or that you at least have an understanding of their perspective in that conversation. And then your extra best friends are the people making the products and the services and innovating, and the ones who want to use the data, right? If you can't get inside their mind and understand what they're trying to do, it's really hard to give advice, right? So that's all free, right? You can talk to people all day for free and try to figure out how to have opportunities to, lightly. You don't have to come in with the sledgehammer, but just sort of lightly, like, oh, I hear you're doing this interesting thing, and it seems to me that this kind of information's involved. Can you tell me more about it? I would love to hear about what you're trying to accomplish and where you want to go and what market. I mean, that conversation can go anywhere, and you're getting valuable information to help guide how to create guidelines and parameters around how to use the data. And you're also creating a moment in time where they may remember having that conversation with you the next time they have to use data, or they want to change something about the product or service, and they will come back. There's a lot of give and take in this, and it's almost entirely relationship based. It really is. You have to have the know-how, you have to understand the laws and everything, but that's what any attorney would be required to do. Of course, you know the law. Do you know your business is really the key there.
Correct. And that's where I think it's so important I can understand the law behind the issue, but if you don't understand how a business works, their ins, their outs, how they do things specifically, right? Because some clients sort of make their own path on how they might go out and sell products, who they really have relationships with. If you don't understand all those pathways, you also can't possibly help them or counsel them how to protect the data, the relationships, their personal information, and overall a general business sense. You don't want to make something so difficult in the legal point of view that, great, I've protected you as much as I possibly can, but you can't move. You're in a straitjacket. It doesn't, I tell some clients, like, I want a really good contract, Regina, that is amazing and that no one can break. I'm like, okay, so you want no one to sign it? Okay. So, because if I give you everything that you want, the strongest for you, it's not a balance, right? It's not a compromise. Your customers also don't want to be just stepped on, so to speak, or your vendors. So sometimes there's a practicality to business also, and to counseling and finding those experts. So a lot of times I'll counsel if my businesses are still kind of small, say, look for some leading industry experts in that area. So if you are in the medical field, look for someone that knows how to set up these protection, these computer systems and their softwares and balances in the medical field, so to speak, right? They can tell you what kind of encryption you need. They can tell you what kind of software someone's using. They have a little experience. So otherwise, it is, they just look at me and they're just like, hmm?
Well, that's a lot. And I think, the third party angle is really, really important too, because more and more you see the concern in these laws that are emerging about what are you doing? What kind of questions are you asking your third parties before you give over any information? How confident are you that, if your house is in order, but then you share information with a party who may be less sophisticated, less mature in their development of their program in terms of data protection, privacy, security. What kind of things are you going to put in either the contract or come around and expect by way of audits or services? And that can be a really challenging conversation, because you certainly don't want to do everything you can to keep your place locked down and have all the processes and procedures, and then introduce a vulnerability unintentionally by bringing in a third party that hasn't really been fully vetted. And, that too can be challenging, right? When you are sharing a certain amount of information, let's say, I have a conference coming up and several employees are going to be attending it, and the hotel needs their business emails to register, for the event. And that's the only thing that they get. And they commit to deleting it immediately after the event's over, all of the bells and whistles. Do you require a full scale security review of that for that point in time data sharing? Because arguably the emails are personal information. Or do you have a layered approach? And I find more and more people are really taking a look at, in parallel to their data programs and whatnot, there's somebody who's looking at the risks associated with working with third parties and really getting an understanding of those that potentially expose the company to the most risk, and putting them in a certain category that receives certain contract terms that are restrictive, certain audit rights that you want to get, certain extra things because they're handling very sensitive information or at a high volume of it, or they are connecting to your network or systems directly. And maybe there's a second tier where there's information sharing, but there are different types of parameters and whatnot. And then there are other, more day-to-day suppliers and things like that who maybe aren't getting any sort of data at all. And do you treat them all the same, or do you have a different approach? Because again, coming back to resources, there are only so many hours in the day. Teams are only so big. You can't treat every single third party identically if you've got a significant amount of them. So where are you being the most thoughtful and the most risk balanced that you can be, while still protecting this information that's very, very sensitive in some cases?
I agree, and you limit what access do they need. They shouldn't be giving them more access to data than they don't. Then they don't need access to all the data. They need only access to what they need to be able to do the relationship. I also get concerned when you have live feeds where a third party can log into my client system, because maybe they're the vulnerable side on their security level. They log in and they can sort of be a backdoor to my client's information. So you're right. It's looking at all those different layers and making sure that you're covering them,
Yeah, and I think you can even some sort of, we'll call it middle tier vendors or whatnot. You can put a lot of controls in place that I think always beneficial to ask them. What is your information security policy? Do you have one in place? How do you tell your employees about the reality that data is very important and sensitive? Are you training them? Are you letting them know that this is something that we care about? If you're not seeing some of these really basic things, you may want to consider another vendor. I mean, it depends on the situation, of course, but I think there's a lot of basics that are not super, super burdensome, but you would want to at least see some evidence that that kind of activity is taking place outside there before you start to your point, connect systems or share information or engage with that third party.
Definitely. So this has been extremely instructive. I don't want to take too much of your time. I know I could go on. I could go on for days. So keep going.
Yeah, I do. I geek out on this stuff. So, we could be on here for a while.
Yeah, so I have my girls behind the camera going, "Okay, Reggie," So I forget what time it is. So, uh, but I wanted, is there anything else you'd like to add, that you can think of that's just sort of like something we haven't talked about that might be helpful for some businesses?
I'll tell you this,
Yeah.
and again, in the spirit of, especially if you're sort of a smaller business, or maybe you're listening and this is not your area, right? But you're working with data, you're doing things. If you're not on the privacy team or responsible for privacy, find the person who is. We're pretty nice. Like, come say hey, talk to them, get engaged with them, and really start thinking about what you can do in your
Yeah.
role to make sure this information is secure. Because I really do believe at the end of the day, no matter what role you play, whether it is the chief privacy officer or something else on the team, taking care of this information is everybody's responsibility. And the dividends that get paid off when people are very thoughtful about what they're doing with the information are,
Yeah.
tenfold at the end of the day. So I would say just find your friendly neighborhood privacy attorney and or counsel and really start the conversation.
Yeah.
A lot of that good work in terms of organization and structure and everything comes down to that first chat. So I'd throw that out there. We're nice people. We try.
Yes, you are, and very knowledgeable as well. And very excited to talk about this area, I find. I have my computer guy too, and it's so funny because I'm like, well, why doesn't that go faster? Why doesn't that? I mean, I'll ask actually basic questions, and he'll smile at me. Okay, Reg, for this reason, it's got to go across the network, and it's got to do this, and okay, thank you. And I learned quite a bit that way by asking those questions, as additional actual technical stuff, not necessarily legal stuff, right? I think it's important, to understand things, especially when they're within your office, your home, everything, right? Because even your home is actually subject to being hacked into, so to speak, and having security issues as well.
Yes.
So, well, this has been so informative, and thank you so much for making time to speak with us today. I think has been really, really helpful to everyone watching and everyone that will watch. We always post our podcast later also so that people can look and get some tips on the area, understand what our speakers are saying and suggesting, and hopefully it's really helpful to our listeners and other businesses. Thank you, Elise. It's so thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. And everyone out there, stay tuned for our next podcast. We'll be announcing it soon. And we want to thank everyone for tuning in. And don't forget to follow us on all our social media accounts. Thank you, and everyone have a wonderful day. Bye. Hi.
Hey.